Okay. Good to see everyone. Good evening. Salutations, felicitations all around. Hope you're doing well this lovely evening. If you have not been here, we are on week 3 of our little mini talk on Sabbath. I'm kind of basically giving you guys some of the insights from a very short period of time, 6 weeks, that I was just deep diving into learning about Sabbath in lots of different ways, through lots of different voices. I think I mentioned to you guys, I think I have about 8 or 9 books that I read through during that time period, and it was super enjoyable and super powerful for me and my family, and felt like I came away with a lot. And I'm kind of like trying to distill some of it to share with us on Wednesday nights, but then also to like invite us into a much different way to live than how I would say like we normally attempt to live, because Sabbath is like super not normal for people, and super disruptive to our culture and the world that we are in. So just like as a little mini recap, we've talked about a lot of things. The first week we talked through Genesis and talked about what Sabbath looked like, and the Lord, creating this beautiful rest place. It's being about wholeness. And really, I think, the heart of it was to just recognize, like, I have to posture myself to receive. That all of Sabbath is about receptivity. And even when the Lord rests in the beginning of Genesis, he does not vacate. We talked about that a lot. That Sabbath is not vacating. It's absolutely inhabiting a space fully. And so the Lord on the seventh day inhabits that space fully, in time, in place, and engages and involves himself and listens and responds. And that's a huge part of the invitation that we saw in the book of Genesis. And then last week, we talked about Sabbath in Exodus, and we kind of sprinkled a few other things from the Pentateuch through Deuteronomy. A few references were made to Sabbath in some of the prophets, but I couldn't go into lots of detail. But we just basically talked about Exodus 20, and we actually talked, for me, I think the thing that I keep coming back to about the Exodus passage is Exodus 16. There's the institution and acknowledgement of Sabbath before the Ten Commandments are given, to remind us how core they are to their existence. And so they're whining and complaining that there's no food. God, what did you do? Bring us out to the wilderness to starve to death. Like, there's this whole phrase. And then the Lord's like, by the way, it's not about that. This is about life and acknowledging life and leaning into life. And so we talked a lot last week about the preservation of life, and that was some of it. And we talked about keeping the Sabbath holy, and we talked about remembering. And so we kind of talked about holiness a little bit, and we talked about celebration and delight a little bit. And we talked about the power of blessing and how blessing kind of concretizes all of these things, because we want to be mindful of our time and our attention, but we also don't want to miss the delight and leaning into the Sabbath as a space of great fulfillment, and the Lord really responding to us. And so this week, we're going to be talking about the Sabbath just in the Gospels. So we're going to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and see kind of some things that are there, and highlight kind of like 3 ideas tonight. If you can hold on, I think we can make it through these 3 ideas. Because I think it's really powerful. I think it's also really interesting because if you've been here on Sunday mornings, Pastor Alvin has actually been, I feel like, priming the pump for this week, because he's been preaching on healing the last 2 weeks. And I want us to look at some of these passages about Sabbath in the Gospels, and probably one of the biggest markers that is in all of the passages on Sabbath is healing. And so tonight, as we start off with our conversation, I would love for us to just take a few minutes and ask the question, what does it mean to heal So it's like, what does it mean? And what is an indicator of healing? And this is how we're going to start our discussion tonight, because we have to kind of get our brains wrapped around healing just a little bit to start with before we go into these Sabbath passages, because of the 48 times in the Gospels, almost every single passage includes healing, which is fascinating. Very explicitly, and we'll talk through them. So, 3 people in a group. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to ask the question, what does it mean to heal? And what is the indicator of healing? And don't be churchy on me, okay? Don't be churchy on me. Don't be giving me these fancy churchy responses. I want you to think about when someone says heal, what's your brain say? What are you all about? What are the indicators that somebody is healed? Okay? Ready, set, go. 5 minutes. All right. Would love to hear some of your thoughts. You can just throw your hand up and maybe throw me out some information or some words, yes, sir, about healing. Okay. They are healed when faith is overflowing. To be determined. Another thought? Yes. To make something new. Okay. What's something else? Yes, ma'am. To restore it to the way it's supposed to be. Love. Did someone, another hand? So it's like a returning. Of course, that's so good. Returning to an original design. That sounds very familiar here at NewSong. Original design. It's kind of our word for the year, so good job. Church specific, Anybody else want to throw something out? What about like some maybe indicators? Like when you look at someone who's healed, what does it look like? Okay, love, joy. Okay, any other indicators? Fear not, Kessler. I love it. Just full range of motion. Love that. Peace. Yes. Peace and calm. Love that. Wow. Freedom. No hindrances. I love all these. So good. I want to hopefully help us process a little bit that I think that when you read through all the stories of the Sabbath in the Gospels, I think one of the biggest takeaways you get is that Sabbath is about healing. So if we're talking about Sabbath, immediately our brains need to move to healing. Healing, and this kind of goes into what our question is about restoring identity and image to a person, okay? And I think in some ways there's a restoration of humanity that happens. And then also in the Gospels, what we get kind of as the final thought is that when we're restored in our identity and our humanity, we are able to reveal, you're going to laugh at this, the Lord image of God. Okay? Because there's an image of God that's revealed when someone is healed and they are restored in their identity and their image, then we get a revelation of the image of God as Lord. And I think that we're going to see this a lot in the scriptures, and I think it's going to be super fun. Fascinating stuff that comes up here that I want to just, number one, in every single story of Sabbath, no one is alone. Oh, see, this is our problem because we already assume that when Sabbath arises, there is a certain amount of, again, vacating, disappearing, isolation, solitude. But in every single story, in all 48 times it's used, it is always in the context of others. This is super important because what happens is we start thinking, when we think of Sabbath and we're processing this, we immediately go to, I want Sabbath. I want Sabbath. And there's a certain amount of self-importance that comes in that, where I think that I deserve Sabbath, that it is mine, that I get it and everybody else, you know what, if no one else gets it, that's fine. As long as I have what I need, I'm good. Now, we don't say that. We just act like it. Because when people start processing, what does it mean for me to come into health and healing and wholeness, I think the natural run to is I need to get mine first. And then everybody else can get it. In fact, we teach this, right? That once, this is the famous one in the pastor's world. If you don't live it, you can't teach it. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense because that would make me say that I have to be an end-all, be-all, perfect human. And I'm not. Not Jesus. Sorry, guys. And so there's like this certain perspective that we begin to buy into that says, I used to be a big advocate of this, but now in my age, I'm coming away from it, where I used to be like, hey, we got to pull the airplane moment on, right? When pressure changes in the cabin, be sure to put your mask on first, and then you can put your mask on everyone else. That's great in the context of an airplane. But when it comes to living a life with God, that is not the path. Because it's always in the context of others. And you're like, oh, Jason, you're already rubbing me wrong. And I'm like, great, welcome to Sabbath. It rubs us wrong. Jesus' interactions in this space of Sabbath are never just with the religious. They're always there, by the way, and they always have an opinion on what Sabbath looks like, and it normally means that they're better than everyone else because of how good they do it. Oh, we're not like this at all. Meanwhile, those godless people, those mundane people, those everyday ordinary humans don't come to church on Sunday. They don't have any idea what this is all about. And we're wrong in that. Because every single time, it is the normal, every mundane people who are not good at being religious that Jesus is often interacting with during Sabbath. Other notices that as I read through 48 different times, it shows up in the Gospels, these are a few of the things that happen. Number one, Jesus is almost always teaching. Amazing. So if your Sabbath doesn't include Jesus teaching you, you might want to reconsider your Sabbath. It's not vegging out. It's receiving what he's teaching. I said this. Pharisees are almost always present. Common people are present, especially those who are in need or who are desiring something. It's very important to acknowledge that part of Sabbath is acknowledging what you do not have. It's an invitation. Another thing, the disciples are always present, observing, and participating. So it's not just a Jesus thing. He's trying to get those who follow him closely to live in the same manner. There is always, this is such an intense one. I was like, okay, I got to tell him, there's always a vehement spiritual, emotional, and mental response anytime Sabbath and Jesus show up. Sometimes positive, a lot of times negative. And there, some of the indications are, the word anger comes up quite a few times. There's this sense of Jesus knows what's in people's hearts because it's all anger, frustration, irritation. There's also elation and great joy, which we mentioned. There's celebration and wonder that comes in on these moments of Sabbath as well. Every single time, and I know that we don't love this as people, but every single time confrontation is present. On Sabbath with Jesus, it's always confrontation, which is crazy. And all the stories, we're going to talk through the stories, I promise. I'm just trying to give you the big picture observations before we get into some of the texts. There's always a confrontation happening, and it's on multiple levels. Sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's physical. There's always some sort of confrontation happening. Questions are always asked, always, and like every single time. And then most markedly, healing, deliverance, miracles, ordering, restoration always happens. Every single story. Sabbath, Jesus equals healing, restoration, deliverance, miracles, ordering, restoration. Sometimes physical, a lot of times social, and then also sometimes spiritual. Really interesting. Jesus consistently in every passage subverts the normal understanding of what Sabbath is and provides a new perspective on it. Not denying what it was historically, but acknowledging that and furthering it. So in order for us to kind of process some of these things, I want to talk a little bit about Second Temple Judaism. If you know what Second Temple Judaism is, raise your hand. Okay, great. This is why I want to talk about it, because this is super pivotal. Okay, so at some point, you might have heard somebody talk about how the Israelites go into exile around 586 BC, And then they come back from exile where they've been in a far land, and they're reestablishing themselves as a people group that are going to follow God again, and they call it the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Thus, Second Temple Judaism, okay? So there's First Temple, Second Temple, and they developed this Judaism that's really beautiful, and really most of it is about reclaiming identity after being in foreign lands for a really long time. Because when you're in a foreign land for a really long time, you begin to lose your identity culturally, spiritually, sociologically, and you become whatever the context that you're in is telling you to become. So they kind of became very Babylonian, kind of Assyrian energies. You know, they got a lot of that. Same thing happens in the book of Exodus when they come out of Egypt. They still got a lot of Egypt in them. And so a huge part of Second Temple Judaism is going like, we got to get the Babylon out of them. You know, because Babylon is almost always a depiction of rebellion against Yahweh, and almost always a depiction of violence, of effort, a war, and mostly dehumanization. There's a deep dehumanizing reality that Babylon gives, and all throughout the scriptures, Babylon's kind of referenced as this spiritual entity that really believes in self-importance. Remember Babel? They think that they can build a tower to access the heavenlies. This says that we can do it good enough ourselves. We don't need God to come down and meet us. We're going to go up there and get what we want. And so there's a lot of that mindset in Babel. So Second Temple Judaism is trying to say, hey, listen, we got to like redefine our culture. We have to redefine who we are. We have to reestablish all of these things so that we can truly be a unique identity culturally, religiously, and politically, or geopolitically, because they're interacting with other worlds in that time. It's very social. It ends up being very social status driven, where if you're a really, really good Jew or you're not a really, really good Jew, there's a kind of a sequence, and some people get promoted and be put in places of power, and then there's some people put way out of here. The synagogue is established in this time, so basically there's local congregations of people gathering together to interact with the Word of God in that time. At the same time, there's this major tension because the Greeks and the Romans are beginning to put a lot of pressure on them. And we get what is called like the Hellenization, or the Greek influence on some of the Jews in this time period. And it creates a big revolt basically between two sects of Jews, where some want to be really, really true to this identity heritage, and then there's another group that's like, we can kind of be Roman and Greek and it works. Herod in the scriptures, if you read, is a very Hellenized Jew. He's like more worried about the geopolitical power with them, rather he is like upholding the ways of the Jewish people that have been passed down the line. On the other extreme, you have the Essenes, which are basically desert, kind of monastic kind of Jewish people. And they're very like spiritual and mystical, but they took all of the laws like so seriously in certain ways that they said that on Sabbath you couldn't even defecate. Like that's how far they went with trying to be super, super, super pure. Like no pooping on Sundays or Saturdays, depending on your seventh day, which is like really intense. So you have like these two huge things. And so Sabbath became kind of a major marker to determine, are you going to follow the Torah, follow the law, or are you going to just kind of be like lazy and follow the Greeks? So Sabbath was like a big marker. So that's why when Jesus comes on the scene, it's such a big deal, because basically you can be put to death if you violate Sabbath. So it's like very severe consequences if you do work on the Sabbath, if you do things on Sabbath. And so that's kind of what's happening in the world. And the Pharisees become basically kind of the judges of everybody's lives on how good they're doing at keeping all of these ways. And so in this world, in this time period, this idea of healing for the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, all kind of culminates in recognizing that healing is not just about one individual, but it is a general manifestation of genuine concern for the well-being of others. that there's a certain saving, rescuing, and then also healing of physical maladies comes into the idea of what does it look like to be saved or to be healed or to be rescued. And so at the end of it all, I think that what we see is that all of these different passages that we're going to just touch on briefly highlight the same things over and over again, and I'm hoping that you will catch a couple of them. And hopefully we can see a lot about Sabbath's about healing. It's about the restoring of our identity and our image, our humanity, and then revealing that the Lord is revealing an image to his people in Sabbath. So Mark 1 is the first place that it comes up. Why did I start with Mark instead of Matthew? Because Mark was written before Matthew, chronologically. So if you ever need to go to the beginning to try to figure out what's going on, start with Mark. It's a really good kind of like setting the stage for everything that happens in the Gospels. And so Mark 1 is the first time it comes out. And it's in verse 21 through 32. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to just highlight a couple moments in it. So, one, Sabbath day came, he went into the synagogue and began to teach. He's teaching. While he's teaching, suddenly a man in the synagogue was possessed with an evil spirit, cried out and said, "Why are you interfering with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus reprimands the spirit and says, "Be quiet. Come out of the man," he ordered, and at that, the evil spirit screamed, threw the man into a convulsion, and then came out of him. Okay? So that's a big deal, right? Because everyone's like, whoa, what teaching is this? This guy like literally is just talking, and all of a sudden, evil things coming out. And so we see like from the very inception of Sabbath with Jesus in the context, that it is revealing that this man has lost his image bearing because something else has taken over his image. Does that make sense? That because he's made in the image of God and this evil spirit is inside of him, it has commandeered his identity and his humanity. And we know this because he is presenting himself as demonized. He has been demonized, which means that he is no longer acting like a human. He's screaming, he's convulsing. These are not normal things that good image bearers are doing. So Jesus deals with it. 29. He leaves the synagogue, and then he goes to someone's home. This is also a normal thing. He ends up with people, like I said, all the time. Simon's mother-in-law was sick. He ends up going to her bed. He takes her by the hand. He helps her sit up. The fever leaves her. She prepares a meal for them. And then it says, that evening, after sunset, many sick, demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus. Lots of healing happens. The demons know who he is. And so one of the things that I want to highlight in this is that part of this Sabbathing that Jesus does is touching people. We see that he touches this woman and she is healed in that moment. Mark chapter 2 is the second time it comes up. Verse 23, one Sabbath day Jesus is walking through some grain fields. His disciples begin breaking off heads of grain to eat. The Pharisees, religious leaders, said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Fun fact, is breaking off heads of grain actually breaking the law of harvesting? To be determined. Sounds like the Pharisees are being nitpicky. Jesus said to them, "Haven't you read the scriptures, what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest. He broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." So just a few things in this passage because this is like a big deal passage. In this situation, we don't see a healing like we see in most of the other ones, but what we do see is an acknowledgement of humanity. Because the disciples are hungry. They're hungry. And then it goes on to say that the Sabbath was made for the needs of people. Now, I know that sometimes we're not thinking about this, but if you were to go back to creation and if you were to follow the whole pathway, what was created on day 6? Man, humans, man and woman, humans. What's on day 7? Sabbath. Which one's first? Humans. Second, Sabbath. So the priority that Jesus is trying to highlight in this passage is saying their humanity of being hungry is more important than them not working. So Sabbath is there to meet the needs of humanity, because part of what Sabbath does is it prevents overworking, it prevents idolatry of self, because that's a lot of what we have in our lives when we don't have Sabbath, is we think that we can control our own world, we can do all the things, we can be all the things, and at the end of all of that, what we realize is that we are not enough for ourselves. We need someone greater than us, the Lord, to be there. And he says, the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. And so there's this revelation that the Lord, the image of God, has been revealed and created for them to remember that not only is Sabbath there for humans, but it's for the purposes of the Lord of it. Now, the Lord of it, the Lord of the Sabbath. What is this idea of Lord? The word is kurios, or kurios in Greek, and it literally has the idea and picture of he to whom a person or thing belongs to, about which he is the power to decide all things. He is the master, he's the Lord, and universally, he is the possessor and disposer of all things. So if you apply that to the Sabbath, that the Lord, God, that the Sabbath is all about him being able to possess it, or him to be able to dispose of something. He has the deciding manner. He is the source. He is the top of all of it, and whatever he says goes. So what is he lording over more than anything else? Life. That's the key. That he's lording over life more than anything else. Sabbath is to protect us from falling away from knowing how to live with God, with others, and in the universe. We talked about this a few weeks ago. And here Jesus is saying, would you rather these men die of hunger? Because this is a reference in some ways to what happens in Exodus 18, where are we here to starve with hunger? There's this picture, it's really interesting. It actually says that the disciples are making a way through the grain field. The word making the way is that they're making a hadas, which if you know what hadas is, Exodus, there's a way out, is what that means. They're making a way through this grain field as they're feeding themselves. So Jesus is showing them there's a different way to live, that you are actually looking for life more than you're looking for anything else. And when you find life, you find the Lord of life. And so Sabbath pushes us to realize that the wholeness in our identity and in our humanity is acknowledging we need life. And it only comes from him, and it can only be given from him and not from any of us. It's all from him. He's the Lord. He gives life, and he takes life. Like, that's part of who he is. He's able to govern life fairly, equitably, and kindly over every situation. Okay. Mark 3, same kind of situation. They're watching him, his enemies. A man's with a deformed hand, and healing. It happens again. Matthew 12, we see the disciples are hungry. This is the same passage as Mark 2. Lord over the Sabbath. We get later in that passage, a woman with a deformed hand, which also comes up in Luke chapter 6. I want to talk about Luke chapter 6, which is also Matthew 12 and 9, because in Luke 6, I felt like this passage really does encompass everything that we're talking about, and then I'll walk through a couple of the other ones as well. So this is Luke 6. On another Sabbath day, so first Sabbath day, one Sabbath day, he's walking through the grain fields and they're breaking the law, and he's like, oh, I'm over the Sabbath. Second Sabbath day, Jesus is just really trying to rouse everybody up by keep doing things on Sabbath, okay? A man with a deformed hand was in the synagogue while Jesus was teaching. The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees watched Jesus closely. They're trying to trap him. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." So the man came forward. Then Jesus said to his critics, "I have a question for you. Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or to destroy it?" Okay? He looked around them one by one and said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. At this, the enemies of Jesus were wild with rage and began to discuss, what are we going to do with him? Okay? That passage to me says all of this so explicitly. And everything we talked about, it's like an explicit version of this. And I think that there's a couple things that I want to just really highlight. One, if you are a deformed person or you have a sickness or an illness in the ancient Near Eastern world, it basically says that you cannot have an occupation. Okay? You can only beg. That's your only option. So what happens when you're broken or you're sick or you're infirmed, that you no longer have vocation. You don't have a life calling anymore, which is really, really sad. Now, the beauty is, in the ancient Near Eastern world, is that the Jewish people are some of the only people, if not the only people, that actually still love and regard those humans. They often took up money to take care of those people. It's a very beautiful thing, very different from most of the other nations. But what I want to highlight is that if each one of us, our calling is to be in the image of God, and something is marring that image, Jesus cannot help himself but to restore who you are and your calling right away. And in this moment, by asking the deformed man to come in front of everybody else, he is laughing at the shame that they would have had on him. Because they would have all had shame in their minds on this man. We remember the story that's like, whose fault is this man's issue? Is it his parents? Is it, there's a certain shame when this happens. And Jesus is like, actually, you've missed it. This is about me coming on the scene and restoring identity to this human in the most beautiful and wonderful way that they could be back into society, fully healed and whole, physically, spiritually, and socially. And so for him to call him forward, come stand in front of everyone, is to remove all of the shame, bestow him with honor, which we talked about last week, is that when you really are embracing Sabbath, you begin to bless other people. And when you bless them, you're covering them with honor. Just like the Lord did in the garden, he covered Adam and Eve with honor after they failed so miserably. And in this invitation, he's covering this man with honor by bringing him up in front of everybody and restoring his identity fully. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And it just continues to reveal that he is willing to lord over every situation until every human is restored back to, and I love this, the original design or the way that it's supposed to be. He cannot, he asked the question, is it a day to do good or is it a day to do evil? Like, he's asking this question, is it a day to save life or destroy it? Now, here's what's really interesting. In Second Temple Judaism, there's this moment where there's a group of Jewish people who decide these Hellenist Jews are driving us crazy, and they decide they're going to revolt. And so there's this whole conversation about the Maccabean revolt, and there's this whole group of people that are following a different way than the Greek-Roman version of Judaism. They want to be more true. And there is a priest that's involved in this. And this priest actually changes or modifies the Sabbath to provide for this injunction, that it would always be for the defense of life. And so basically, because what was happening is like the Hellenists were coming in and slaughtering people on Sabbath because they're not working. They couldn't pick up a sword. Like, so these, this fight that was happening, they're like, okay, you can fight only to save a life, basically. And so Jesus is pulling that in Second Temple Judaism, saying, hey, is this a day to save it or destroy it? And what an invitation he's giving to all of them to say, hey, just so you know that when it's my day, Sabbath day, I'm the Lord of it, I am always going to choose to save a life. This is going to be my primary function, is to save a life. And that is ultimately the way we have to approach healing when it comes into our everyday lives. Healing is not an option of, does God want to heal this person or not? It's always the day of salvation, right? This is the day that the Lord has made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it because he is always willing to bring life to restore that human and that person, however that looks, socially, spiritually, psychologically, mentally, physically, all of the things. It goes on in Luke chapter 13, giving another instance of Sabbath that I want to highlight. He's teaching in the synagogue. He sees a woman who's been crippled by an evil spirit. She had been bent double for 18 years and was unable to stand up straight. Jesus sees her. He calls over to her and says, "Dear woman, you are healed of your sickness." Then he touched her. You hear all the same words happening? Touched her, calls out to her. I mean, like, there's all of this all of this humanization that's happening, because you don't want to touch somebody who's sick in that world, because then that sickness can get on you, and then you can become impure, and you have to wait a long time to be connected with God, like, because that's how their mindset was. And Jesus calls her over, "Dear woman, you're healed." He touches her. Instantly, she stands up. How she praised God. But the leader in charge of the synagogue was indignant. Like I said, there's always a response, that Jesus healed her on the Sabbath. And he says, "There are 6 days of the week for working," he says to the crowd. "Come on those days to be healed, not on the Sabbath." Now, I want you to notice this, because this shows that healing is significant in the Jewish religion of this time. This is not just Jesus does this. It is part of the culture spiritually that the priests can heal people. It's powerful. So he's calling them out on missing the life because they're obsessed with the legality. They've become a slave to following the protocol instead of leaning into the life that's behind the law. Because we talked about this before, I have like a big pet peeve. We're like, sometimes Christians are like super anti-law. Oh, okay, I'm going to step on your toes a little bit. Don't be trying to pull Paul on me, because I'll pull it right back on you. And I'll pull Jesus on you, because Jesus says it. I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so you have to recognize that law is not how we mostly talk about it. Law is a defining cultural kingdom perspective and reality that they are inviting people to live into that is contrary to the rest of the world. That's what law is. That it is a guardian around them maintaining their image-bearing status, which reveals healing and the Lord of all life. We somehow get this twisted because we think Jesus is always trashing law. He's never trashing law. He's just saying, don't miss the big point. The big point is life. The big point is image bearing. The big point is humanity is made into my likeness. Don't miss that. Don't forget that. Don't get obsessed with these details that aren't the picture that I'm trying to give you. The details can be significant, powerful, important, and can all reveal and portray me if you want them to, or you can miss what my heart is. You can miss what I'm actually about. And so I love it, because this is like this invitation where they're like, "Hey, come on the other days to get healed." And he's like, whoa, you missed it, because it's always about life. It's always about healing, not just the 6 days. The Lord replies to them, "You," the worst word ever, "hypocrites." He says to them, "Each of you works on the Sabbath," because they're priests. Oh, come on. See, all of a sudden you make this new connection that they actually work on the Sabbath. And it's okay, because it's what? To reveal life. That the temple is to be the place where the presence of God is demonstrated and revealed and expressed, and their job is to facilitate it and engage it, and they missed it because they limited it to a different day than every day. Because he wants it all the time. He always wants to give life. Every day is a Sabbath day to the Lord. because he's the Lord of it. So what's to say he can't deem Sabbath to be happening perpetually? He can. Not to get into next week, but there is a rest for the people of God when you're with him. There is a Sabbath when you're with him. And we can talk about that more next week. I love this, though, because he goes on to say, don't you untie your ox or your donkey from its stall on the Sabbath and lead it out for water. Now, why would you lead your donkey to water? So it won't die. Like, you see what I'm saying? He's really trying to get them to understand, hey, you're missing this if you think that keeping your animal alive is more important than a human restored into the image. There's an invitation for them to not miss the life that they could be embracing. He goes on to say, this dear woman, a daughter of Abraham. Like, that's a big deal. Because Abraham is the daddy, for all of these people. Like, he is the father of faith. He calls her a daughter of Abraham, indicating that she has a lineage of relationship that is accessible to her. And it says she has been held in bondage by the accuser for 18 years. He says, isn't it right that she be released even if it's on Sabbath? The answer is yes, it's right for her to be released, because the Sabbath is about our freedom and our healing and our wholeness. It's fascinating that in his response of highlighting the life that they've missed, it says, this shamed his enemies. But all the people rejoiced at the wonders. That's so powerful to me, because I think that's what happens in every moment of Sabbath we're offered in our everyday life, is either somebody is going to be shamed because we're not choosing life, or they're going to reject life, and when they reject life, shame happens. Can we find that life? Can we lean into that life? Luke 14, another situation, Jesus touches a sick man and heals him. He basically says, hey, if your cow falls in the pit, don't you rush to get him out even on the Sabbath? They don't answer him. John chapter 5, Jesus is at Bethsaida. There's porches, there's sick people. There's a guy that's like, I love this because I think it's really powerful in the realm of Sabbath. He's like, I don't have anybody to help me get into the waters to get healed. See, it's an isolation moment. And the Sabbath is made for us as humans, day created on 6, to be with God on 7 with each other. This man on the Sabbath is alone trying to get into a pool of healing, and he can't because he has no one. And Jesus says to him, do you want to be well? And he moves towards that isolation and refuses the isolation that denies the image bearing and heals him. And he says, stand up, grab your bag, and walk. And then the Pharisees get mad because he's carrying his mat. I'm like, how did they miss this? You're mad he's carrying a mat rather than this man is living a life of an image bearer again. He's been restored in society. And Jesus actually tells him in one of the other passages, go talk to the religious people so that they can deem you well. Right? It's powerful. And so this whole thing happens. They get mad. They're frustrated. You can't work on the Sabbath. The law says you can't carry your mat. And he's like, but the guy who healed me told me to pick it up. And you're like, but for him, you have to understand, the man who healed me, who gave me life and restored my identity, I'm going to follow his lordship, his leadership, because he healed me. Because he moved towards my isolation and said, you are not to be alone. You need an image-bearing reality come back upon your life. You need your restoration so you can be in society, so you can fulfill the calling to reveal me in the world as an image bearer, as a carrier of the presence of God. It's so powerful. So powerful. And they were like, who said this? And the man's like, I don't even know who he is. Which is funny. Jesus disappears into the crowd in this passage, which makes me laugh really hard. Can you just imagine Jesus like, hey, y'all, watch this. poof, I disappeared into the crowd. I love this. And afterward, Jesus finds the man in the temple and tells him, now you're well, stop sinning, or something worse could happen to you. Because that sin is the corruption of the image bearing. So pay attention. I don't want you to just live however you want to live, because that's the other extreme of live as a Pharisee, very calculated, or live however you want to live. That's not the way either. I'm asking you, could you live in this new way, in the way of life that's modeled after me? And when this happens, the man went and he told the Jewish leaders, it was Jesus who healed me. So then it says the Jewish leaders begin harassing Jesus for breaking the Sabbath rules. And I really felt like this is an important place to stop today for us. And I'm going to talk about a few things as we end. I won't talk about John. John has a few more passages. But when they're harassing him for breaking the rule, Jesus' reply is really fascinating to me. This is in John 5, verse 16. He says, my Father is always working, and so am I. So all the Jewish leaders tried all the harder to find a way to kill him. For not only did he break the Sabbath, but now he called God his Father, and thereby making himself equal with God. Again, he's revealing this lordship picture. Jesus explained, I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. Okay, this is so powerful, okay? Because you have to remember it in the context of this healing, in this wholeness, in this Sabbath thing we're talking about. The Son cannot do it by himself. Why? Because if he did it by himself, he would be alone. Oh, come on, you didn't catch it. This is all about moving towards someone when they're alone, being together and with them. And if that you have that witness, you embrace Sabbath. Because Sabbath was created so that man could enjoy God and God could enjoy man. I don't feel like you're getting it. I'm trying really hard to break it through your hearts. Because it's so powerful that he says, Jesus is like, I'm not going to just do this thing solo and pretend like it's just about my own self-importance and I can walk along, mamby-pamby, all by myself, just doing whatever I want to do. No. I'm coming into alignment with God, my Father, and I'm going to do the stuff he's doing because I want you to come into the lordship of my Father as well. I'm the Lord. Be in my image and likeness, and refuse to let anybody be alone, physically, socially, spiritually, etc. Move towards them until they are made whole and complete. Because the Sabbath day is about everything being complete. Oh, come on. It's all moving us to completion with God, completion with creation being exactly the way it was supposed to be, and being with each other exactly the way we're supposed to be together. This is like mind-blowing to me. As I'm reading this, I'm processing it. I've heard this preached before, but not in the context of Sabbath. But it's directly connected to it because they only harass him because he broke the Sabbath rule. That's what it says. So then they're mad, and Jesus says, I love this. He only does what he sees the Father doing. So this is beautiful. Because this means that God, in his Sabbath lordship reality, is not just sitting around doing nothing, vacating. Oh, come on. Ho, ho, ho. See, because we've bought into the lie that we have a God who just sits up out of everything and doesn't really give a rat's butt about us. Oh, come on. You pretend like you don't think that, but when you pray, is God just sitting up on a throne way far out of your existence and life and not inhabiting what you're in? That's Sabbath God. He inhabits. And so in this moment, he's like, when I see my Father doing something, I'm going to do it too, which means I'm not going to vacate either. Oh, come on. This changes our eschatology, friends. This changes that God did not leave us and go to heaven to be away from us so that we can one day vacate this place to be away from it. No. He sends another one to us. Remember this, the Holy Spirit, because the point is that we would not be alone. So that everything can come back to its original design the way it's supposed to be. You have a question? Please. Yes. Mm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Love it. Right. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Children. Yep. Yep. Yes. 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 So if you couldn't really hear some of that, or if you were on the live stream, our sweet friend Missy, she is involved in a community that is Jesus believing Jewish humans. And she's like encouraging us in this to say, hey, listen, the Jewish people don't think of themselves as being obsessed with the individual picture. That for them, so much of Sabbath is revealing the fact that it's husband and wife, that's oneness, with God and with each other, the family with the children, because it all starts with blessing, and then with the community, because so much of the existence of the people of God throughout history is in community. And when you're in community, that's where you're restored. That's where you're healed. That's where you're made whole. This continues. Talk about this next week a little bit, but this continues in the New Testament depiction of a temple that's made of living stones, a body of many parts. This is an extension of this Sabbath living reality that the Christians continued from Judaism into the first century. And so I think for us, like the challenge is in these moments is that the Lord refuses to not reveal himself in this communal way to us, because it is in this communal way that we find fullness, wholeness, healing. I was thinking about this the other day. I saw a video about a man who came to Jesus, and he was living an alternative lifestyle to what we would prescribe in the scriptures. And he basically was saying, I know that I cannot find certain things if I were to have followed that lifestyle that God, he didn't want me to do that. But he started to talk about what the church would mean for him in that way. That he's like, I might not find a spouse. I might end up being single my whole life, but could I find people who would walk with me? Could I find a family that would adopt me? Could I find a community that would help me heal, even if I never got married, or I'd never, followed that traditional path. Instead, I followed a celibate path. And it's just like, it was this moment for me to ask the question, how well are we doing this thing on Sundays or every other day of the week when we see someone who's begging and looking for restoration, healing, and wholeness, and forgetting that we are the carriers of it? Like, we are now the participants, because if whatever the Father's doing, the Son's doing, whatever the Son's doing, the Spirit's doing, whatever the Spirit's doing, we're doing. For the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he's doing. In fact, the Father will show him how to do even greater works than healing this man. Then you will truly be astonished. For just as the Father, again, gives life to those he raises from the dead, so the Son gives life to anyone he wants. That means that you can give life to anyone you want. Oh, that's a big responsibility that we're not ready for, because Sabbath confronts us to say, you've been living for self. You've been living for you. You've been thinking that self-importance is the only way to live, because, no one thinks highly enough of me. I'll think highly of myself. I'll love myself, and then I can love other people. And I'm like, actually, what you have to realize is that you have to have everybody else in this thing to be who God wants you to be. And your self-importance is stripped away because the Lord importance is the highest reality. I love this because it says, in addition, this is so good. So you get this life picture, right? The Father gives a life to anyone he wants. And then the very next verse is about judgment. And you're like, judgment? How does that play into Sabbath? Well, let me tell you. If you remember, a few weeks ago, I was highlighting to you that we forget that judgment has already occurred at the end of day 6 and the end of every day, because each day the Lord says, and it was good. That's his judgment. He is determining what it actually is. And so when we enter into Sabbath day, the judgment has already been said that it is good. And when I operate in a Sabbath reality, I start recognizing and operating as everything is good, or everything is in its original design, or it's the way it's supposed to be. And so all of our judgments that we might have, we have to submit them to the Lord of the judgment. And his judgment is that every human is to be restored into an image bearer. Every human is to be made whole in life and family and community. Every human is to be able to carry his image in the earth in a way that no other human can, but we have to do it together. I think it changes so much for our existence if we can lean into this. John 7, John 9, both have more indications of the same. But I want us to end with this thought challenge. I've said this a few times. This is not about me. And so what happens when I'm at my best and I come in contact with another person, I actually become Sabbath to them. And when I become Sabbath to you, I am so rested and so desisted and so ceased in my own reality that I accept you fully into the life of God. That in some ways, Wayne Muller talks about that he says this, we are the emptiness and the day of rest. We become the space that our loved ones, the lost and sorrowful, they can find rest in us. He quotes, whenever two or more are gathered, there I am in the midst of you. Not fixing, not harming, not acting, quietly empty, we become Sabbath where the sorrows of the world are safely poured and gently dissolved into the unfathomable immensity of our rest. And I think that this is exactly what Jesus does, that he walks around through the Gospels. If you go read all the stories, just Google Sabbath in the Gospels. He walks around and he is so at rest and he is so whole that he cannot just walk up to somebody who's not whole and not fully embrace them. He cannot stand for somebody to feel alone, to feel sick, to feel distanced, to feel disconnected, because he is so rested, so emptied of himself, that he is embracing the fullness of God in the earth through all of us. He's welcoming everybody home. He's trying to say that we can come into this space and be whole together the way it was always supposed to be. And so, my challenge, my encouragement to you is, are you going too fast every day to be the Sabbath healing for the people you encounter? Are you moving at a rate that is so quick that you would miss the person who is begging to be healed? 18 years, 16 years, has no one else. And that in those moments of stopping for someone, a wholeness happens, a healing happens, a restorative moment happens, an identity is reclaimed and refound. And when that happens, God is seen. It's so significant. It's so powerful. One of my favorite things that I read the entire sabbatical was from this little book called 3 Mile an Hour God. by a Japanese theologian named Kasuke Koyama. And in it, he talks about Jesus in this beautiful way. And it's a longer passage, but I want to read it because I think it really embodies what we're talking about in the realm of healing. Jesus walked towards the full stop. He lost his mobility. He was nailed down. He is not even at 3 miles an hour as we walk. He is not moving. Full stop. What can be slower than full stop nailed down? At this point of full stop, the apostolic church proclaims that the love of God to man is ultimately and finally revealed. He's talking about the cross. So God walks slowly because he is love. If he is not love, he would have gone much faster. Love has a speed. It's an inner speed. It's a spiritual speed. It is a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It is slow, yet it is Lord of all other speeds, since it is the speed of love. It goes on in the depth of our life, whether we notice it or not, whether we are currently hit by storm or not, at 3 miles an hour. It is the speed we walk, and therefore it is the speed the love of God walks. So the invitation into being a healing Sabbath person in reality is to walk so slowly that you can love whoever you come in contact with. And if you're not slow enough, you might miss an opportunity to see him. Because when you're slow enough, you'll see him in every face. You'll hear him in every conversation. You'll engage him in every sad, wonderful, up, down moment. He is there. And the Sabbathing that Jesus does is that he notices people who have been there for years, friends. I just was like struggling in my heart to imagine that there are people who were standing there 16, 18 years, and no one showed up for them. No one stopped and restored their identity. No one, not even the religious people who could heal. Like I mentioned, they didn't. And Jesus could not stop. And the invitation for us is, could we stop and be that kind of Sabbath healing rest, maybe in one touch, maybe in one word, maybe in one conversation, maybe in 1 minute, 1 hour, maybe even in 1 second. That if we live at this level of healing, wholeness, calm, peace, shalom, healing, identity, reality, Sabbath, then everyone will be whole. Because this is what we see our Father doing. As he lords over the universe, he's not there to lord over it in domination. He's there to lord over it until everything is the way it's supposed to be. And we look at him and see him as the one who does that. And then we become like him as we see him. So the invitation tonight is to slow your life down, to bring healing and Sabbath rest to others. And if you feel like you don't have it for you, then walk up to somebody else and see if they offer it. Because it's available. Amen? Jesus, help us with this, because this is so foreign in our hearts and our minds. And Jesus, we just ask that we would recognize that if we could just spend that space with you when we're with people and around people, Lord, that we would see what you're doing and hear what you're saying, and we could align with you and be with you in it, so that we might see healing and we might see restoration of identity and calling, Lord, that we would see the Lord of healing, the Lord of Sabbath, show up and make all things whole and all things good. Lord, we desire that and long for that in this community. Lord, would you help us walk at the speed of love? In Jesus' name, amen. Love you guys. Come next week. We're going to talk about the rest of the Bible and Sabbath. Like I said, this is distilling so much information and content, but I'm hoping that you're getting glimpses of what the life of Sabbath looks like. And I'm excited to tell you that we will be starting a new series come October 1st on the book of Exodus. And I'm really excited for that because, like I mentioned before, Exodus is about learning the way out of the slavery and the life that we've lived into becoming the people of God and worshiping Yahweh. So come out in October. Come out next week. We love you. You're amazing. So glad you're here. Peace, healing, and wholeness to you all tonight. In Jesus' name.